Nonprofit professionals, have you thought about using gift cards? They're especially helpful this time of year. Think holiday gifts for the whole team, year end bonuses, and even direct support to families in need around the holidays. Charity Charge has a free gift card program just for nonprofits with no sign-up fees or ordering minimums. Text or email a digital card for face value, no extra cost, or ship a physical card if you prefer. Let our team support your year-end projects and save money on your gifting. Visit charitycharge.com to learn more and beat the holiday rush. Now, on to the episode. Thanks for tuning in.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Charity Charge Show. I am your host, Stephen Garten, founder and CEO of Charity Charge. Today, I am very excited to have one of our newest friends here at Charity Charge, Melissa Lagowski, who is the founder and CEO of Big Buzz Idea Group, powering nonprofit organizations to fuel positive change in the world. Melissa, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Hi, Stephen. Super excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. I am very excited to interview you today. And part of what just was so interesting to me when we first met was you sharing your story. So I do want to get into Big Buzz Idea Group and what you've been doing there, helping organizations for over 21 years now. Before we do that, though, can you talk to us about your background before you were doing that and ultimately what led you to start Big Buzz Idea Group?
Absolutely. In 1999, I was serving as the executive director for a small nonprofit in the city of Chicago. And I loved what I was doing. I was doing 24 events a year, 12 newsletters, 8 committees, and managing 225 members. And it felt like my dream job, but I was a staff of one and I got burnt out in about 3 years. And so I left and I went to corporate America and I worked for a fabulous company, division of a Fortune 500, but I just did not fit there. I knew I needed to get back to the space that was making an impact. And lo and behold, I started kind of doing some soul searching and went back. And it turns out I had started fundraising a lot when I was like 11, 12 years old, planned a fundraising event in my backyard. And so it just seems like philanthropy and nonprofits and really that contribution was part of who I was. And so that led us to then starting Big Buzz Idea Group. And so, yeah, and now it's been 21 years later, and I absolutely love it. I never meant to create a company. It really was meant to be a job I liked. And lo and behold, it continues to grow. And we've just continued to serve a niche as an honest partner for a lot of organizations.
And we have, when I think of the few thousand nonprofits that we work with, there are a lot of organizations. I mean, something like I think 95% of the nonprofit industry is under $1 million in revenue. And when you were sharing your initial experience as a nonprofit ED, these are people that are unbelievably passionate, committed to the cause and the mission of the organization. They're oftentimes experts in understanding the challenges that are going on in their community and the unique solutions that they're doing. But they are overworked, underpaid, under resourced. And you having that firsthand experience, I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about you going through that, but now also what you've seen as the struggles and the challenges in the nonprofit organization industry when groups are under resourced.
Yeah, it's funny, right? Hindsight is always 20. And so I kind of started on this journey knowing that it felt very right. As I got further and further into the company and really started to kind of get my eyes opened a little bit more, it became very clear that generally your boards don't necessarily know what the staff does. So A, they don't know how to help. B, they really don't know what's going on in the day to day. That's not their skill set, because that's a funny story in and of itself that maybe we can come back to. And so what I started to realize was that one person generally can't do all the skills that you need to really run an organization. And yet most organizations at that level you're talking about, they only have limited funding for one, maybe two staff people if they're lucky. One person to wear all the necessary hats. I mean, I was an event planner. I was the admin. I was the strategic leader. I was, the membership coordinator. I was the writer, the designer, the editor. Like, that's not something that the average person can do. And when you look at what is really popular these days for people to lean into their strengths, those other tasks either start to fall off of the radar, like sponsorship is a big one. We see it a lot in development work. That if somebody's not really, kind of trained in that area and has those skills, they end up doing busy work and not actually making the impact and securing the funding that's needed. So you start to work in some areas, and some areas get neglected, and then inevitably there's burnout. And so it becomes the revolving door that keeps organizations really, really stuck where they're at. And, I remember as I learned a lot about the accounting side of it, most organizations wash, rinse, repeat. You take your budget, you look at how you compared this year, maybe you raise it a little bit, but if you keep doing what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always got. If an organization really wants to make impact and grow, they've got to make some intentional changes to that budget. And so you really do start to need an expert looking at that and helping you navigate where you're going to go. I remember when I was serving as an ED, I remember saying we needed to save for a rainy day. And our board was like, no, you need to reinvest all the money every year into the community we serve. But lo and behold, right? Like now I've seen an economic recession and I've seen a pandemic. And I learned my idea was absolutely spot on that you need to be saving for a rainy day. You really need to run a nonprofit like a business. And to your point, most organizations don't know how to run a business. And so we find a lot that, at Big Buzz and other organizations like us, we have the ability to fill gaps on teams. We have the ability to just be able to fill a hole they might have or share an expertise that might be missing. We've seen a couple of organizations who shall not be named, but they had bad bookkeepers who had not submitted reports for 6, 7, 8 months. And an organization can't run without knowing their numbers. That is key to being successful. And so, we've really started to do a lot of things to try to train organizations, help organizations know what they don't know. But to your point, it just takes more than one single skill set to really level up an organization. And so, to your point, that's organizations need to really start to think differently if they want to get over a million. And we want to see more organizations do that.
And we'll get into the specifics of your business model and the variety of programs and how you help organizations through Big Buzz. I'm curious before we get there, put yourself back in those shoes, or imagine that there's absolutely going to be nonprofits listening to this episode that are in that difficult spot where they're the only employee of the organization. They're wearing all of the hats. When you meet an executive director that's in that situation, what are some of the initial things, the questions that you ask them or questions they should ask of themselves? What could be even a 1% better to just start to how they could think differently or operate the organization to just start to make incremental improvements? One of the huge things that, and I'm still obviously through my journey in growing Charity Charge, and we started with, we were not a funded company in the sense we were bootstrapped at $0 in revenue. I've grown it now for 10 years, learned a lot of lessons along the way. And I definitely 1000% believe in the power of a vision and having this big picture and having grand plans. But a lot of then the success comes from breaking that down and then just saying on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, quarterly basis, annual basis, what are the little things that I can do to stack? So I rambled on there, but yeah, what's your initial kind of conversation look like with an ED that's challenged, that's doing meaningful work, sees the impact, but is just stressed out, burnt out, and running into roadblocks to get out of just being that solo employee.
So many things come to mind. First, they have to take care of themselves. I think back to when I was an ED and I was so focused on trying to give to everybody else and serve the role and just be on all the time. And that's exhausting. And so I think, first of all, nonprofit staff leaders have to really just take some time to fill their bucket. And then I think we have to start to think differently. I
And
think,
how would you, can I just say,
oh,
would
yeah.
they do that through meditation or self-care or any practical things come to mind?
Absolutely. I think some of the first things that come to mind are setting some boundaries for yourself. I know I was available all hours of the day, nights, weekends, and that's just not sustainable. So I think working with your leadership to understand kind of what the parameters are you're going to work within is something I advise. When I was in the nonprofit space, somehow I felt like we were expected to get beat up. We were expected to be, not paid well. And so I think, first of all, I think nonprofit leaders really need to realize the magic that they hold and the skills that they own and the great work that they do. And so those boundaries and advocating for themselves, I think, is really important. I think that when it comes to filling somebody's bucket, it's a very personal thing. So definitely thinking about what recharges you, making sure you I mean, I've got a teenage daughter and I'm constantly drilling in right now the concept of like proper rest, good nutrition, you know, they can't go unrecognized. Like those are some really good basics. Beyond that, like how do you treat yourself? How are you pouring into yourself? Because it's much like the oxygen mask on the airplane. You've
Mhm.
got to take care of yourself first. We started a power cell program that is just for peer to peer
You just read my
connections.
mind. I was gonna ask you about that. I think
You
that's
know,
super cool. Tell us more.
yeah, it's a safe space, it's meant to be where executive directors or other nonprofit leaders, staff can come together with 2 or 3 other people like themselves and share in a confidential circle so they have a safe space. I think that becomes so important. Other groups I know, I mean, they have banded together with similar organizations or maybe within different industries in the nonprofit space, they have other peer-to-peer groups, so take advantage of them. So I really think that there's a lot on that personal care that starts to be important.
And I'm
And then I think it
curious
sorry.
to go a little bit deeper there because there's kind of two things that I've seen that juxtapose one another in, you know, being around thousands and thousands of nonprofits now. One, I completely agree with you. When I get into closed, safe spaces and I'm having, especially a one on one conversation with an executive director, what oftentimes come out is how stressed out they are. And they're dealing with challenges of some bad board members, and they don't know how to handle that. They've got to look if they're a little bit of a larger organization in terms of staff, even if you've got 2 or 3 people to manage. That's a lot, and you've got to be on for them and be that leader. You want to be that. And then you've got all these funders, corporations, individuals, or maybe, relationships you're trying to build for grant funding. And they're asking you to do things that will create mission creep, or they're just straight creepy, like having really awkward conversations, sexual harassment. That happens way too often. One time is too often, but it happens a lot in the nonprofit space. There's not enough conversation going on about that issue. Um, but the other side where I mean it juxtaposes is I see a lot of nonprofit executive directors feeling like the other organizations, while I feel like they could be their peers, they look at them as competition because funding's scarce. So it sounds like you're advocating for trying in whatever way they can, and you've outlined some ways where they can get that community of other peers that they can relate with and work through these issues.
Yeah, when I started, at that nonprofit and I do wanna make sure we come back to the tactical ways that
Sure.
organizations can kinda help too, I've got a couple ideas there. But when I started at my organization, so it was one neighborhood out of 75 in Chicago, and I came into a space where everybody seemed so competitive. And the reality is that when they decided to go from that competition to collaboration, it was a beautiful shift because they each had their carved out areas. They each had their differentiators. And I find that in the nonprofit space, I mean, one of the ways we can stop the burnout and save some of, do things better is in finding strategic partnerships where maybe you have some synergy with a fellow nonprofit. And I think a lot of funders like to find those collaborations because they feel like they can make a bigger impact with their dollars if they're supporting a team of organizations. So we've actually found some people who can get additional funding that way. And I really find there's a couple of leaders in Chicago in particular that just always impress me so much because anytime they get grant funding to help with education or leveling up, they always bring other nonprofit leaders with them and find ways to share those resources. And it's helped all of them level up in their leadership and their abilities. I think there's a lot to be shared. I think there's a lot to be learned. And when we stay siloed, then everybody's reinventing the wheel. But when we collaborate and we come together, there's just so much that can be learned to kind of shortcut the learning curve. And I really think that everybody should be leaning into collaboration.
Speaking of collaboration, so going back to some of the tactical stuff, and correct me if there's a different way you wanted to chat about that. How did you come to this power cell concept?
It was really interesting. I think I thought back to my day, and one of the reasons I got so burnt out was that, to your point, I was on for our sponsors, I was on for our event coordinators, I was on for the local businesses, I was on for the board members. It just never seemed. I was constantly afraid if I said anything negative, people would think she can't do this. And I really just then found myself holding it all in. You fast forward to the pandemic and it just started to be like, oh my gosh, these people are going through things they've never experienced before. And some people, I think a lot of people, I didn't know where to find help when I started. I was very fortunate going back to that collaborative spirit that I found a neighboring executive director who she kind of took me under her wing and she became my first mentor in the space. And lo and behold, then fast forward, she became one of my first clients. It just, we both were able to grow and expand by leaning into that relationship building. And so the Power Cell was kind of inspired from that space. I think a couple other tactical things that I really would encourage people to do is I find that when we're looking for volunteers and support, we often cannot answer that question on demand. I would find myself so caught up in the day to day or in the thick of it that somebody would go, how can I help? And I'd be like, I don't know. And you don't go back to it. It's a conversation that just kind of fleeted by and all of a sudden you're no better off. But I like to encourage leaders to make lists as they go about the different types of projects that, well, this would be nice to have, or, oh, this could make a difference if we had somebody to do this. And I feel like you should always be maintaining and keeping that list so that then when you go to your board or when you have somebody come and they say, like, I'm in marketing and that's my day job or that's my superpower. How could I help you? And you can go to your list and you can see, like, what do you need designed on there? What marketing messages might you need created so that you could actually ask that person who has that expertise to give you something that would be more valuable than you could do on your own. And I think that we often are not prepared for that. And lots of times, what we end up, I found with a couple of organizations that people will tend to ask for very tactical database entry or something, mail stuffing, which is very helpful. But many leaders that really want to support you and your organization might have a higher skill level. And if we can engage them at the higher skill level, then that could alleviate some projects off your plate. That could bring in additional resources. And if you're engaging volunteers at that higher level, I think there's more buy in to your mission. So sometimes, and I would encourage you to find those community resources. I know I used to be able to work with a local after school program that helped a lot to show their students what it was like to give back in the community. So they helped me do a lot of my mailings. So it was really nice to find some different resources at different levels and think about how to engage that. The other really tactical, simple thing that I encourage people to do is in the nonprofit space, we get so busy with the day to day stuff that we overlook the important work. The urgent overrides the important, right? And if
Read
people,
Stephen Covey.
right? And if nonprofit leaders can identify like 1 hour a week to focus on strategy, where they want to go, to your point, what's that bigger vision? Because when you can see it and you write it and you can just imagine it happening, everything around you starts to, I feel like in the universe, line up to help you get there. So taking that 1 hour a week for some strategy work, some of the important work that will really move the needle for your organization is really important. And I encourage people to carve it out at the beginning of the week when you're fresh and before
Right.
all the other demands on your time start to overrun the week so that you don't lose it, because otherwise we end up foregoing it at the end of the week.
That's smart. I try to do that on Sundays here, but exactly. I'm aligned with you. Bringing this conversation along to Big Buzz Idea Group. You've kind of set us up a bit for it, but can you talk to us, give us some examples of the types of organizations that you've helped and the challenges that they're having? And I think part of it too is with some of the advice that you just gave, there are ways that leaders of organizations can kind of cobble it together to get to that next step. But then there's an opportunity for working with people like yourself, right? That have organizations that can step in and help in a professional way. And also talk about the service on the account management, or excuse me, the association management side.
Yeah. It's interesting, right? I think it is like those small journeys up the ladder that just allow you to grow and expand. And so for some organizations, we're the entire staff. They don't want to manage people, they don't want to have overhead costs, and we can fill that need. We work, though, with a lot of teams that may be one, two, three people strong. And they have, like there's just they get stretched too thin and they cannot be effective. And so when we can step in and we can become their staff, it's been really nice. They don't have to train us. Lots of times they're looking for a part-time person, and part-time people often decide maybe they need more hours, or, they may ebb and flow, but we're fine with a few hours a week, or, or peaks and valleys during the year based on a certain project. I think being able to fill that need in and of itself is something that has helped us help not more organizations across the board. We love, like, our ultimate, to your point of leveling up. We have one client that just they went from us being an administrator for them to now they're hiring an executive director. They were able to We helped them shore up their bookkeeping. We got their finances in order. They were able to see things more clearly. And now they're able to build future forward where they want to go. And I often say that, if we've done our job right, some of our clients will outgrow us. And, that's great. We love seeing organizations thrive and expand that way. So, yeah. Otherwise, I think a lot of organizations, they have that budget for maybe one person, and maybe that person is good at, like, the event planning and the marketing. But then there might be those other pieces that are just really hard for that person. And so, being able to have outsourcing partners that could just do that one thing can really help an organization start to kind of, I think, rise higher.
And what's the geography of the organizations that you're working with? Are they generally in the Midwest where you are?
Ironically, they're not. They used to be pre-pandemic, and I think the pandemic, some good things did come out of it, and it removed a lot of barriers. And so now we are consulting organizations across the country. We've got a client that's based in Virginia, but the ED lives in Las Vegas. We've got another client that, is in Washington. So we just really are serving organizations in a lot of different places. We've had clients in Indianapolis and in Atlanta. So geography has not been a barrier the way it used to be.
This concept of a nonprofit looking outside themselves and being able to outsource all or some of the functions of the organization might be a novel idea, right? Again, if you're put yourself back to being a executive director and the only employee of an organization. So I'm curious, obviously we met and I was really impressed by you as a person and your track record and your know-how. And I felt that there was a real connection here and an opportunity to share out what you were doing. Of course, there are other, consultancies, let's call it, for nonprofits out there. So I'm curious from your perspective, though, if this is a new concept for a nonprofit, what are some of the questions that they should be asking you or anyone that they might be chatting with to try to identify, can this organization really help us? Or is it a con? Are they actually going to be able to follow through?
Yeah, that's a great question, because part of what just tugs at my heart is I've seen some organizations really taken advantage of, and it just broke my heart. I mean, we watched one organization get run into the ground by an association management firm, left them with over $100,000 debt. They did not seem to be a team player. They did not seem to kind of be really integrally aligned with the organization, and it broke my heart. So I think that your question is a really, really good one. Absolutely, everybody needs to go in with a strategy, and I think people, when you are feeling burnout, exhausted, it's easy for a consultant to say things and you to kind of be like, "That's exciting," and like, "Yeah, let's do it." But we need to take the time to kind of, to your point, don't rush it. Have the meetings. It's just like an interview. It's like dating. Like, you want to have a series of meetings. You want to have a series of conversations to give yourself time to reflect and think about what they're saying and identify what you really need. I think sometimes we know what we need, but we haven't taken that strategic time to document it, think about it. And so when you go in not knowing what you really need, you're not setting yourself up for the maximum success. I think asking questions about the clarity of what the consultant can deliver or won't deliver. There are certain things that, we try to be very clear about. We can't promise the sun, the moon, and the stars, and we're realistic. Like sponsorship is one, right? I will use that as an example that clients want to know, how much will you raise for us? There's so many variables, and I can't promise a dollar. The landscape is constantly changing, and the way it goes is constantly changing, but we try to set up parameters where they have no surprises. That's another thing. I would encourage organizations to make sure that if you're working with a consultant, a package price or setting financial thresholds that they will not exceed is incredibly important. I have watched some
That I totally agree with.
Have you seen that?
Well, just in with our own company, yeah, getting the bill at the end of the month and going, "How the hell did you get to this price?"
Yeah, I've seen a lot of organizations where they get those extra invoices and it's crippling. So I think, and then they got to start to forego other services or other staff or salaries to
Mhm.
be able to keep the organization afloat. So really like thinking about financially, what can you afford? There's a lot of kind of getting your own ducks in a row first. I like to try to help our clients or potential clients walk through some of that. I like to help them, be able to ask the right questions because we want to be a good partner. We're not trying to put anybody out of business. Our goal is to help organizations grow. But I will say you've got to do your due diligence because I've also watched one nonprofit, they worked with a professional event planning company that tripled their gross profit and cut the net to the organization in half over when the organization was doing it all themselves. And nobody knew how to figure out why the math wasn't mathing to their advantage. So definitely like look at your resources, definitely ask tough questions. Also, just give yourself permission to ask questions. I think sometimes we hold ourselves back and don't really consider it an interview, but it is. You're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you, and the best partners are going to really find that magical alignment where everybody wins. So you want to keep that in mind.
What are ways that you've seen well, let me preface this. One of the insightful things that I learned and was told, when I was starting Charity Charge by a mentor of mine who had had decades of nonprofit experience and then created a software platform for nonprofits. So she had this interesting whole, background for a couple of decades running nonprofits. And then she was in a space where she created software that was used by tens of thousands of nonprofits. And she said to me, "Stephen, the nonprofit industry, on average, is 10 years behind the for profit sector when it comes to adopting new ways of doing things, new technologies." And I found that to be somewhat true. So, knowing that, I'm just curious, what have you seen over, your decades of experience in the nonprofit industry? How have things changed? And then also, where do you think nonprofits are still not up to par or kinda taking the lessons learned that they might be able to from the for-profit industry?
What a fun question. So I'm obviously dating myself, but going way back to when I was an ED, I mean, I helped the organization build their first website. They did not even have an accurate inventory of all the businesses in their geographical area. So, I mean, I was walking door to door and I was collecting information, right, the hard way. We have had a project recently where it's amazing, like what could be found on AI to find business lists and more information. And so, I mean, it's moving at a lightning speed now. But I think about one of the best examples that plays into what your mentor had said was banking. It was so difficult to have to run all over town and get signatures on checks to pay bills over my early days. And
Mhm.
again, coming out of the pandemic, you had to do online banking. And I think it's one of the best things that has ever happened. I think that really embracing technology, it's hard because people don't have enough time already And even though technology can make their lives simpler and save them time, they don't have time to learn it. And so I think when you have those platforms or you have those systems and trying to be able to find ways to teach people to utilize them effectively and things like that, it's still a bit of a gap. There's so many good programs out there, inexpensive, really good, available. And leaning into that is just, it's going to save you light years. Again, and sometimes I think this is a place where maybe a volunteer could be good because they might be able to do something or already know a skill you don't. I think about a Monday or an Asana for project tracking, for
Mhm.
example, and a lot of people use them. So if you know somebody who uses it in their professional career and they could come in and teach your staff directly, you're going to learn so much faster and be able to apply it. But often, I mean, people may pay for one of those subscriptions and then they just think they're going to get to the videos or the training and they never do. I encourage people to keep leaning in. I think AI, utilizing it and doing it ethically and strategically is really something organizations should lead into because otherwise you're going to fall further behind if you're not really kind of, and then, right, and then you hold your organization back. It's really hard to be able to make the advances and the impact that you want to make
Mhm.
as an organization. So I think leaning in is so important and figuring out how you can leverage resources to teach you what you don't know. Again, the collaboration of other peers in an industry, in the nonprofit space could be helpful. It's worth the time and investment because I mean, when you apply some of those, they're going to save you just hours per week and over the cumulative of a year. I know one platform we utilize here at Big Buzz is always a great example to me that we used to be manually tracking, these reports. And when we went into a software that does it, I mean, we a part-time person. And I not to say, right, everybody's afraid of losing jobs, but the problem we have in the nonprofit sectors, they're already so short-staffed. So, you're not losing jobs, you're learning to gain efficiency. And then when you have those dollars from those efficiencies, you can hire more people at a higher level to make greater impact. So, I think we have to reframe it and look at it a little differently.
I'm glad you've said that. You're the first person that I've heard talk about AI in that context, in the sense of there are others that think of it as doom and gloom of what it might do. I mean, I look at it as even I'm 39 now. I mean, I've seen changes in industry, some industries go completely away, and there's still some nostalgia around like a local record store or something like that. But when I wanted a CD, I used to go to the music store and I would buy a CD, and I'd play that, listen to the track over and over and over again. There became the Napsters and LimeWires and some of the other copycats for file sharing. And then Apple Music came out and then Spotify came out. But think about for all the engineering jobs that were created because of that. And so whatever, we can look at back, the same people were saying this when like the automobile came out, right? It's like, well, what about all the people that, take care of horses? Or build the barns for horses or whatever you could do it. It's like, well, then there created a need for supply chain and mechanics. And I just think that when something's moving, you've got to embrace it. But there's always in economics concept of a productivity shock that is. And your point about the nonprofit is, yeah, there's not necessarily that there's jobs to lose. There's impact to be gained through it. That's really cool. Talking about the AI on this. So on one of your recent blogs, you outlined specifically, a bunch of things. Some of them you touched on. I want to talk about your AI in the context of fundraising because like I've never met a single leader of an organization that doesn't want more money for the organization, right? And isn't trying to figure out how can we fundraise more from the people we already are fundraising from or individuals, corporations, or how do we attract new donors, et cetera. Can you talk to us about in the blog you had some points about nonprofits using AI to create more personalization amongst their donors. So, can you talk a little bit about that? And then any thoughts, AI related or not, around fundraising?
Yeah, I think that one of the things I love best about AI is I think about all the times when I first started and how I just wanted to have some people to brainstorm with. And it felt like I would either meet with people who just said more of the same thing or couldn't think big enough or didn't have enough creativity. That's not their skill and talent. And, with AI sitting there daily, you have a creative thought partner. The ability to ask it questions and, like, get some ideas to get something jump started, I think is really great. I think the ability for AI to do message differentiation in the old days, my lord, as a one-person shop, I loved the idea of segmentation. I hated the practical I couldn't find the time necessary to enforce it or to act upon those recommendations. And the idea I could barely get one newsletter out, so the idea of segmenting or doing 3 was, like, overwhelming, exhausting. And so I think now there are ways to think about, how to differentiate yourself. Just ask more of those questions where you're getting stumped. Is there a better way to say this? How
Mm,
could I take this message but make it more compelling? So what I find is that the more you lean into giving it more details about the specificity of what you want, I think the better output you're going to get. I used to also wonder, right? Like, where can I find more of the individuals? Like, what individuals are funding this type of cause? Which individuals in Chicago are supporting animal rights or whatever that case may be. Looking at the different types of organizations, you can put it all in and get some feedback to maybe get some ideas for some new leads, especially when it comes to corporations. A lot of corporations have gone with the social responsibility focus. They're looking at things that tie back to their mission more directly. And so we, as I think nonprofit people, have to do more due diligence before we approach an organization. And so I think really, like, being able to find the companies that support the arts or whatever your cause might be starts to make an impact. I think when it comes to grant research, it's a great thing to throw out there and ask the question to see if it can uncover something you haven't thought of before. So I think there's a lot of those types of things where you can use it for that. I think also being able to upload your data and even ask, like, what trends do you see here? This kind of goes slightly off topic of the question, but in nonprofit in general, I think people have to identify their top 10 or 20 individual donors, top 10 or 20 companies, supporters, and, like, that's where you should be spending your time to also try to get people to level up. What I've always found in my fundraising work is the importance of understanding what the company or the individual is trying to, what are their goals? What impact are they trying to make? Because then you can find where they align with your organization to find a more successful partnership so that you can try to keep forging those relationships and building them up. I think that's a really great way to increase funding. And then again, don't be afraid to ask the questions too. I think I was too young back then and I just was not savvy enough to ask more questions. Go into every single thing with curiosity, whether it's AI, whether it's a donor meeting or a sponsor meeting. Just ask more questions because when you get to know people better, that's when you get more buy-in. That's when you can find, and if you can get them to see the vision you have for your cause, they're going to start to open their pocketbooks and their wallets, and you're going to be able to receive, more larger donors and larger investments into your programs. And then ask those people, who do they know that might also support those initiatives? And that was the question I never asked because like people often know like people. And so, how do you leverage that to your benefit?
that is really awesome advice. I really appreciate you sharing that. I'm trying to reflect on it a bit too as I'm just taking it all in. But I really appreciate you going deeper there on different ways that, you know, how organizations can think better, think different. The curiosity piece is definitely something that every now and then I get out of that. And I just realized I should have just been more curious. And there's so much more that I could have learned just by asking questions. So I
Well, and
really,
I think I don't know why I used to think you couldn't ask the questions. But, when we're trying to forge relationships and we're trying to be more collaborative and less conflict oriented, questions, what makes you think that? Why did you go that way? What made you think about it from that perspective? Why do you think that's important? It helps people tear down any misunderstandings to, again, across the board, whether it's your board, your staff, your donors. It just helps make better relationships.
is there any thought process or exercise that you personally go through, as the CEO of your company to think about the next year, whether it's reflection or taking time off? I mean, do you have any sort of ritual
Yes.
before January 1st rolls around?
So I think that there are probably 3 or 4 things that everybody should do. So, 1, I'm gonna go back to that run your organization like a business. And that does mean reflecting on the current year, what went well, what didn't go well, and kind of like what might be holding you back.
Mhm.
I think to your point, I would encourage everybody to craft that vision of what an ideal 2026 would look like for you. And then, really think about what would you need to get there. And if you can start to identify those pieces and those things that are needed, again, it helps inform conversations. It helps you go to your board more strategically. It helps you be able to talk to donors more efficiently. And this time of year, a lot of organizations are having those conversations. So, knowing where you want to go, if you're excited about that and you can get other people excited about that, then you can find ways to make it happen. So, I think carving out that strategic time and then you nailed it. I guess I'm up to probably 5 things now at this point, but
I love it.
I also think that taking time during this busy time of the year, everybody needs to recharge and start the year. I love newbie, and so I think it's important to recharge your battery before you turn the calendar over.
Melissa, thank you so much for being a guest today on the Charity Charge Show.
Thank you, Stephen. I really love what Charity Charge is doing, and I think you guys fill such an important gap in the arena. So I'm honored to be connected to you. Looking forward to many future collaborations as we continue our journeys.